Happy Tuesday, everybody. Thank you all for joining A Behavior Analyst Talks About Education today by Professor Charles Catania. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us this topic today. And I wanted to thank each and every single one of you attendees for joining us and viewing and wanting to earn CEUs from this presentation. Without you, we will not be able to have these webinars. So I wanted to extend some gratification and appreciation there as well. This is the second webinar of 2024. So we're going to jump into it, as I said, about education today. And over the next 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn, well, just about 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs. And the way that you'll earn those CEUs is by staying the entire webinar, and also by answering poll questions that are going to pop up on your screen. So I hope you joined with a join webinar button that was emailed to you earlier today, yesterday, and last week, depending on when you registered. But if you did not join with that join webinar button that was sent to you via email and you dialed in on your phone for audio only, I'm going to ask that you please use that join webinar button as well. GoToWebinar cannot record your attendance if you have dialed in audio only. So even if you have technical difficulties, you can't see, you can't hear, it's not working, to 100% proper, please make sure you still join with that join webinar button alongside your dial in, so this way you can try to get the most of the webinar as you possibly can with getting credit as well. All right, if you don't need CEUs and you didn't purchase those and you just need a generic certificate of attendance, that's going to come a couple of hours after we end here today. And as I said, it's completely free. All right, go ahead, throw questions in the questions box of the control panel that you see there. I will answer the ones that I can. Otherwise, we will have some time for Q&A after the content and throughout the webinar. But otherwise, for now, I'm going to mute myself and I'll go into some more detail about CEUs when the first poll comes up. Here's Charlie.
Okay, greetings everybody. Let's hope 2024 is an improvement over 2023, and I won't go into the details there. I will be talking about education today. As usual, a lot of what I have to say will be also based on some material that's included in this book. And we're putting this up here to let you know that that if you were interested in any of this, that there's for getting a discount and free shipping, you should use the link shown there at Sloan Publishing. And I thank my publisher for helping me to keep this book going. And many of the times in the past webinars, what I've done in starting out is to give a trigger warning. You know, some of the things you're going to hear in this are going to be disturbing. And I decided instead to put up this quotation from H.G. Wells, going back more than a century ago. Notice he wrote that book in 1920. Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And you know, some of the political things around today are about education. Whether you support the public schools or want to give people vouchers so they can pick a private school or a religious school and so forth, whether to support homeschooling and whether you should have any kinds of documentation for what the child in homeschooling actually gets taught. Is it indoctrination into a cult, or is it a lot of science? Whatever. And so there are all these kinds of things around. There are schools that still advocate punishment for kids, and in which it's still legal to swat a kid and spank a kid in some states. And so to the extent that whether a kid wants to be in school may be correlated with the kinds of things that happen in school, we can see that that's an issue as well. So that makes this a really centrally important topic. And although some aspects of what we're going to talk about may be disturbing because they describe what our culture is like and where we are, it's important, at least as important as the issues of things like climate change and the survival of democracy, because without an educated population, those other things will be less likely to be dealt with in an effective way. Now, I'm my reputation, probably for most of you, is this guy is an experimental psychologist. He worked with pigeons. I guess he did some of you know, I also worked with kids and or did some work on verbal behavior. But at the beginning, education was really central to what my interests were. And so let me talk a little bit about some personal parts of this history. I'll start out with pictures of my two most important teachers, Nat Schoenfeld on the left and Fred Keller. Fred Keller was teaching the introductory course I took when I was a sophomore undergraduate. Fred was, as many as you will know, was a graduate student at Harvard when this younger guy came along named B.F. Skinner. And Fred already knew the ropes, being a graduate student in the department at the time, and sort of took Skinner under his wing. Fred was one of the few people who called Skinner Burris, which was Skinner's first name, rather than Fred, because the F in B.F. Skinner stands for Fred or Frederick. But since they were both Freds, to keep that straight, B.F. Skinner was Burris to Fred Keller, who was Fred. And in fact, when they used to give talks together at ABBA and places like that, they'd talk about the two Freds. Nat Schoenfeld was actually originally a social psychologist. He came along after Fred Keller had set up an undergraduate program in psychology, or an undergraduate major in psychology, which was based on Skinner's work. And that was really one of the very first courses. There were a few things in other places, Jim. There was some things going on at Indiana and elsewhere, but this, and at Harvard itself, of course. But Fred Keller got that going at Columbia College, part of Columbia University. Nat Schoenfeld was in the department at the time as a social psychologist and started working with Keller on teaching things. And he was so taken up by it that he ended up moving over, and the two of them produced a book called Principles of Psychology, which was a behavioral textbook, maybe one of the first ones around, certainly one of the very early behavioral textbooks. Their curriculum was one in which the first semester and both semesters of a one-year introductory course included labs. And the fall semester was a rat lab, and the spring semester was a human lab devoted to verbal behavior and other things, which is a remarkable thing when you consider that we're talking about the mid-50s. The book came out in 1950. It was the textbook I used. I took Keller's intro course, really was taken by it. Without that course, I might have gone into any number of other fields. Then after I finished Keller's course, I went on to take Nat Schoenfeld's experimental psych course. And that by that time I was enough involved that after that it was pretty inevitable that I'd go on in the field, and I'll say a little bit more about that very briefly. This is a picture that turned up by accident not too many years ago. This is Fred Keller's Intro Psych Lab course. This was the spring semester in which we were doing experiments on verbal behavior. And the two people standing here in lab coats, on the left here is Nat Schoenfeld, and on the right is Fred Keller. And I don't have any recollection of this picture being taken, or even that there were pictures taken in that lab. But talking with Fred Keller back here on the right is me. And it turns out in this booth in the middle, this guy, Richard Berger, was my lab partner back in those days. And one of the ways it and confirming that was that I sent this picture into the Columbia Alumni Directory and you know, in the class notes kind of thing, and got some feedback, and ended up with an email correspondence with my old lab partner Dick Berger, and confirmed that yes, this was me. So anyway, this was what got me started in the field. I fell in love with the material. In this semester, we were doing experiments on verbal behavior. Incredibly, years and years later, Fred Keller had written his own autobiography and had trouble getting it published. And I was in a position, because of my own writings, and Bill Weber, who's the publisher for Sloan, who publishes this book. Bill Weber agreed to publish Fred Keller's autobiography, so I was involved in the editing and production of this book. Those of you who are interested in it, it's a remarkable story. It tells about not only his life as an academic in the early days and the beginnings of behavioral stuff, it also talks about growing up in upstate New York. It talks about how he got to Brazil and got behavior analysis started there, and how he came up with paced instruction. The title is just marvelous, At My Own Pace. Fred Keller, as many of you know, was the founder of what we now call paced instruction, in which students can work at their own pace. And he was the one who set a lot of that up. Now, notice, in talking about this, I am talking about education. Fred Keller was devoted to his teaching. Now, part of it was the kinds of lectures that Fred Keller gave, and part of it was the kinds of discussions that Nat Schoenfeld had with students in his experimental course. All of that was what nowadays teachers talk about as motivational. But there was so much in the content besides that it really just carried many of us along in the field. Now, a little bit more of that history. So I took Fred Keller's intro course as a sophomore, took Nat Schoenfeld's experimental course, one-year course as a junior, and as a senior, I took one seminar which was taught by Keller and Schoenfeld and another faculty member named Ralph Hefferlein on verbal behavior, and I also took a seminar with Fred Keller on teaching. And each of us in the class, there were probably fewer than 10 of us in this small advanced class, students who had taken other coursework in this major already. And we each had to pick out a project and write up a paper about it. Now, at that time, my brother, I was an only child until my brother came along, and there was 13 years difference between us. So when I was taking Fred Keller's seminar, my brother was about 8 and in elementary school. And I decided to make my project to teach him some algebra lessons, teach him some algebra, and to use the distributive law in mathematics as the basis for teaching it. And so here you have it, the distributive law. If you're summing two numbers and you multiply by another number, x times, in parentheses, y plus z, the answer you get is the same as multiplying the first number by x, multiplying the second number by x, and then adding them together. So you can either do the addition first and then the multiplication, or you can do the multiplication first and then the addition. You always come up with the same answer, and that's what the distributive law tells us. So 2 times 4 plus 3, well, 4 plus 3 is 7, and 2 times 7 is 14. Well, if you do 2 times 4, that's 8, and if you do 2 times 3, that's 6, and 8 plus 6 is 14. So you get the same answer both ways. But what I did with my brother was just set up these sessions. We'd do it anywhere from 15 minutes to a half an hour, and I prepared material. And what I did was not to have one specific sequence of things to go through in which he'd master, but to try to teach this in as many ways as possible. Have him do the computations with actual numbers. Have him define the law. Have him work with unknowns and so forth. In the course of doing that, I ended up teaching him some algebra, because he was pretty soon able to substitute something for x, and it could be a different thing each time. Now, not to say that he went on to mathematics, but he did eventually become, in his career, somebody who wrote programs for businesses to do payrolls and things of that sort. So probably some of this didn't go to waste. He actually used it, and I like to think that what I did contribute to that. And then I wrote a paper in which I talked about education, making the point that you could teach something in one way. You could teach things by rote and just do it in one way. You could teach kids only to read by phonics, or you could teach kids only to read in other ways. Or why not mix them up? The more ways in which you learn something, the more stimuli are, the more the variables are that contribute to the right answer, and therefore the more competent you become with that material. And I wrote that paper up. It must have made an impression because Fred Keller, of course, recommended me to go on, and I did go from there uh, to Harvard as a graduate student. And and now here's the other part of the story that's of interest, because while I was an undergraduate, Skinner came down and gave a colloquium across the street, across Broadway at Barnard College. And his topic of that colloquium was teaching machines, because that was a thing, one of the things that Skinner was developing in the late 1950s when I was an undergraduate. And so his teaching machines were proposing that you can automate some of the rote stuff. You don't have to have a teacher going through all of these kinds of routines. The teacher could spend time doing more important stuff. And so the idea was never one that the teaching machines would substitute for teachers. Rather, the teaching machines were supposed to be tools for teachers to make their job easier, so that they could do things with large number of students that would be hard for an individual teacher to do. Now, Fred Keller was influenced by all of that too, because Keller had during World War II set up programs for teaching American servicemen who had been recruited for fighting in World War II, either in Europe or in the Pacific. And he had programs for teaching large groups of recruits Morse code, which was a common method of transmission. So if you had ships out in the Pacific and they were communicating to each other, you don't do it openly with talking to people, but Morse code was one efficient way of doing it when communication was not like it is today, where everything's connected to everything else. So Keller was already into those kinds of things, and was already by the end of World War II thinking about doing things in education and advancing things. So when Skinner was starting to talk about teaching machines as well, their interests converged, even though they were at different places. Skinner used the teaching machines to back up his undergraduate course at Harvard, which was an introductory course called Natural Sciences 114. And during that time, Skinner also came out with a book on the technology of teaching. And so all of those things began to come together. And when I went then to Harvard as a graduate student, I was going up there because I wanted to work on teaching machines. It happened that the early things we had to do as new graduate students in those days was to work in the Pigeon Lab and to do our projects. One project early on in the semester in the Pigeon Lab, we were also going to be doing other projects with humans and verbal behavior, and those sorts of things came later. Lou Golub was the person running the lab at that time. Lou taught me a lot of what I know about programming and so forth, and I just ended up captured by schedules reinforcement and the marvelous extent to which you could really get these exquisitely controlled performances in working with pigeons. And so that eventually got my attention sufficiently that although I remained interested in teaching, um, I worked on a lot of these other kinds of things. Well, that's sort of all by the way of background. I think it's time for us to tap into things and see whether folks are listening a little bit, and also to capture one of the requirements for you folks getting your credits. So I'll turn it over to Marissa now, and she's going to ask you a question. Here you
Alrighty,
go, Marissa.
thanks, Charlie. So, which is true? And go ahead and select an answer. A blue box should have popped up on your screen, and as I said, you should be able to select an answer and then lock it in with that submit button. Don't forget to do that part. Please don't put your answers in the questions box. It's so much harder to try to um, try to look at all the data afterwards. Um, if you need CEUs, please make sure you do participate in these poll questions. It's a requirement. If you don't need CEUs, please participate for fun, but you don't need to in order to get your certificate of attendance. Um, Now, again, if you didn't purchase CEUs earlier, you can totally do that after the webinar. I'm going to have your instructions to you by lunchtime for your CE certificates. And as I said, just that general certificate of attendance, the one for free that will not have any ACE provider information or BACB numbers, will come a few hours after we end here today. So just keep that in mind. When you look at that blank, pretty generic certificate, that's your general certificate of attendance. There's special instructions to access your CE certificates. Okay, cool. So let's shut this one down now that it looks like enough people have voted and I've blabbed on enough. Looks like 7% say Skinner invented a teaching machine, 19% say Keller invented paced instruction, 69% say both A and B, and 5% say neither.
And of course, the people who answered A and B were the ones who were correct. Okay, so shall we move on? Okay, here we go. So first of all, let's talk a little about some of the background of where education is today. Because one of the things that's been troubling me over, I guess throughout just about all of my career, is how our notion of reinforcement, which for us seems fairly straightforward. It's something that happens. It's a thing that happens just as evolution happens. You don't need a theory. Evolution did not require Darwin's theory of natural selection. Evolution was something that happened, and it was a name for something that most people were convinced happened because of the evidence that was available in fossils and so forth. All kinds of things converged to make evolution recognized as something that happened. The real question was, why did it happen? Then Darwin came along and came up with a theory for how it happened. Well, the reinforcement is kind of like that. I mean, back in the 50s when I was a student, the idea was this theory of reinforcement as if somehow it was derived from something, but it's not a theory. It's something that happens. Sometimes you see an organism responding in a certain way, and then that way of responding makes something happen, produces a consequence, and then the responding occurs more often. To the extent that's what you see happening, and you're pretty sure by playing around with what you know about the circumstances or figuring out what's been going on in these situations, you're pretty sure that the reason the behavior started to occur more often was because it was having this consequence. Then you say, aha, there it is. That happens some of the time. There's an example of it. We call it reinforcement. Yeah, it would be nice to know what the nervous system does to make that happen. It would be nice to know all sorts of other things about it, but it's not a theory. It's something that happens. Back when I was a student, though, it was a theory. And there were all kinds of debates about it, and because it was a theory, that meant that philosophers could argue about it. People who were coming at this stuff from other orientations could argue about it. And the debate was whether this theory was going to be overtaken by other kinds of theories, and you have cognitive theories and so forth, and a very complicated history. And you have all the kinds of things that people worry about. So, for example, parents picking up on this and saying, well, if you're doing that and you're getting the child to do it just because the child gets something, that's bribery. And that by itself was given as a reason for not doing it. Well, think about it. If the parent says, if you do X, then I'm going to let you do Y. If you put away your toys, I'm going to let you play on with the iPad or with the Xbox or whatever the kid plays with, and the kid then does it, some people would look at that and say, yeah, you've got a response and you got a consequence. Why isn't that reinforcement? Well, I'll tell you why it isn't. It's because this is responding that's under control of a particular discriminative stimulus, a verbal one. Mommy and daddy do that only after telling the kid, And so this is the sort of thing where the kid will then do what the child has been told to do only if the parent has made the deal. Well, what's the point of bribery if the only time it works is if you're there to watch and make the arrangements? No, in fact, the parents ought to learn to be patient and wait until the child does something like put away just a couple of the toys and then deliver the reinforcer. That would be reinforcement. So even something as simple as this, imagine this. You're a student in a teacher's college in the 70s or the 80s, last century. Um, um, and this is the way somebody who is not a behavior analyst is talking about reinforcement as one of these alternatives open to be learned about by people who are now going to be teachers in elementary schools or high schools or wherever. Um, Now, there's a long and complicated history of this. It goes back to Edward Lee Thorndike. This is the Thorndike who uh, started out at the turn of the 20th century, over 120 years ago, doing his experiments on cats getting out of puzzle boxes and things like that. But he went on to Teachers College at Columbia and ended up developing programs that were going to be teaching teachers to teach. Now, some places have teachers teaching programs and education majors in which you cannot do that unless you also have a subject you major in. So, for example, on my campus, UMBC, we had a dean who was actually in the field of education, and he insisted that every education student also had a major in history or math or some other field along with the education field. But that was not universal, and teachers' colleges were a little bit less likely to do that than when an education program was embedded in an undergraduate curriculum. So the things that happened, though, was during the 20th century, um, the United States went from just about everybody going to elementary school, but high school was a sort of more of an elite institution. Not every kid went to high school. Many kids didn't. And so in the 19 teens and the 20s, the country began to institute compulsory higher education so that you were expected to continue your education on through high school. What that did was immediately created an enormous demand for teachers, and teachers' colleges sprang up all over the country, uh, charged with the thing of teaching people to teach in school, whereas before it had been a much smaller population of teachers and so forth. Um, Now, during that time, other things were going on, and I mentioned at the opening of this that um, the ways of changing behavior throughout the time, particularly if you're talking about the early part of the 20th century, um, the idea of discipline, the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, the idea that it took aversive kind of control to teach things, that sort of thing in some places got embedded in curricula. And teachers who started in those days often went on to remain teachers through a career that lasted 20, 30, maybe 40 years, even though by that time the understanding of what went on in learning was changing dramatically. And there were even more problems. So somewhere around in the late 60s and early 70s, social psychologists began to do experiments on something they called the hidden costs of reward. Give you an example. You have a bunch of kids in an elementary classroom and they're doing finger painting. And the experimenters come along and they persuade the school to run this experiment, let them run this experiment in which the kids in one group are told that they should just continue the finger painting. Essentially, they're the control group. They go on doing it and nothing happens. For another group, they are told that there's going to be a group of visitors and they want to let the children know how important it is to do finger painting. So whenever a child finishes finger painting, the child gets a gold star. And then afterwards, that time period is finished and the gold star is no longer given. And what happens there is The kids who got gold stars and then didn't get them anymore, according to these published studies, did a little bit less finger painting than the kids in the control group. And what was the conclusion drawn by these social psychologists about what was going on? Well, these gold stars were artificial rewards. They were, and what they did was they were extrinsic. That is, they weren't part of the reward of doing finger painting. And what they actually did was undercut the intrinsic reward that you get when you do finger painting. And when you take that away, you've actually undercut the intrinsic reward, and those are the hidden costs, and therefore you don't want to do this. Well, it turns out we now know, and there's a whole literature there, and by the way, the next slide includes some of the literature involved in this. The early stuff back in the 70s by Lepper and Green and Nisbet, undermining children's intrinsic interest with extrinsic reward, ending up with a whole book called The Hidden Cost Reward. About 15 years later, Alfie Cohen publishes a book called Punished by Rewards, in which he argues against artificial reward in the classroom. By that time, people were beginning to catch on, and some of our behavior analyst colleagues began to look at the statistics on it. Detrimental effects of reward, reality or myth, pervasive negative effects of rewards, the myth continues. These are the debunking articles that are now available if you wanted to look into this. But what they did was they looked at large numbers of studies, and they found out things like this kind of effect only happens if the reward really is non-contingent. That is, it didn't matter whether the kid just put one little streak of paint down on the paper or actually filled out the whole paper and made a full painting. The kid got the gold star essentially. It wasn't really much of a contingency there. The other thing was the magnitude of the effect was smaller the bigger the group. And that, for those who do meta-analyses of statistics, is a giveaway for a problem. If the bigger the group size, the smaller the effect, even though it's statistically significant, it suggests that what's happening is people are publishing this stuff if they get a statistically significant result. They're more likely to get a statistically significant result if they get larger groups. But the only people who publish are the ones who get the statistically significant results. And this became such a hot thing in the 60s and 70s that lots and lots of places were doing these kinds of experiments. And not every one of them got an effect, but the ones that did published and the ones that didn't. And so you'd expect a certain number of people to have gotten an effect merely by chance. Well, the literature now on this is just incredibly persuasive. But to give you an idea of where this goes, I mean, the New York Times used to have an education supplement and with the Sunday paper every so often, and in the supplement, when it came out, maybe once a month or so, they would have a quiz for the reader in different topics. And one of them one day, as some years ago, was psychology. And among the subtopics of these quizzes, in which they had multiple choice questions, was the field of learning. And the multiple choice questions that they used in this New York Times things was a subset of the questions used in the psychology version of the graduate record exams. And one of the questions was a multiple choice thing in which the correct answer identified by the paper, and therefore the correct answer identified on the GREs, was one in which you had to answer that giving artificial rewards has hidden costs. So and this was well after Eisenberger and Cameron had published their stuff. So this stuff was still embedded in psychology education there. It was still embedded in courses in schools of education and in teachers' colleges. And so teachers that came out and finished up their degrees back in the 70s and 80s and 90s were taught that it's not a good idea to use artificial reward in the classroom. Just think of it. kid gives you a right answer for telling you that that funny shape on the board is called an A, and the kid learns to call that other funny shape a B, what is there intrinsically about that that should make the kid continue to do that if nothing happens when you get it right and you do that? Except teachers were being told, don't use artificial rewards in the classroom. Actually, what we know about the classroom is um, it's totally inappropriate to leave out the reinforcers. It's actually counterproductive to leave out the reinforcers. Yet when Nancy Neef and some of her graduate students and I did a collaborative bit of research um, her students were at Ohio State, um, uh, they were working within some of the local inner city schools, and they were finding that some of the teachers there, if the kids gave a correct answer, the teachers did nothing, and they went on to the next question. And if the kids gave the wrong answer, that's when the teachers dumped on them. And these were teachers who were puzzled that the kids didn't want to come to school. Um, this has been a pervasive, destructive educational consequence of a bunch of experiments by social psychologists who perhaps had political axes to grind, and whose effects on teachers over decades have cost their students heavily over the years. We now know and some of the effort that Nancy and her students were involved in was to turn that kind of thing around. And fortunately, some of the teachers who have been taught that way are now moving on. And fortunately, at some places where, so for example, at Teachers College at Columbia University, we have people like Doug Greer who know better and who've been turning out lots of students who are going on in education who know better than to believe this stuff. I mean, there was even a case in which Oprah Winfrey brought on a parent in tears who brought her child onto the stage weeping and saying, "My child has been reinforced." Not not to even mention that who would ever talk about the child being reinforced rather than the child's behavior. Those of you who've heard me talk in the past know that that's one of my pet peeves. We reinforce responses, we reinforce behavior, we don't reinforce organisms. So if you want to read that story, this is the way it is. So this is the kind of thing we're up against in a culture that minimizes the effects of rewards, that thinks reinforcement is threatening, that thinks it's more important to do things with via aversive control in some places. Again, as I say, there are states in which it is still legal for teachers to use a paddle on a kid to enforce discipline. Uh, what does it mean? It means that they don't know how to teach, and they don't know the things that we know, and yet they continue to pass their exams and be qualified and all. And sometimes people who've got a substantial education in the kinds of things that we know about are at a disadvantage in even getting positions. Um, uh, just another example, back in the early time when I was here in Maryland, Don Hake formerly from West Virginia University, was doing some work, uh, and his wife, who also was familiar with behavioral techniques, was working as a teacher's aide in the local schools. And his wife was criticized because she was helping kids by working with them, and she was happened to be delivering reinforcers. And in fact, her position in doing that was jeopardized because the teachers thought they knew better uh, than Don's wife about what was appropriate in the classroom. I could go on and on and on, and actually I will be going on and on because we're only just getting into it. But I've done enough for a little while, so let's take another break and let's see what the answer is to this next question. Over to you, Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody. So, which is true? Go ahead and take some time to answer this one. Alrighty. give it just a few more seconds. Please keep in mind that these poll questions are a requirement if you wish to earn CEUs, but otherwise it's really good just to participate so Dr. Catania can know exactly where you stand in the content so far. Alrighty. So it looks like 31% say contingent reinforcers produce hidden costs. No one said
Oh,
reinforcement equivalent to bribery. 2% said
okay.
both are true.
Yeah, okay. Now,
And
folks, this really troubles me. Okay, I made a whole point about how the hidden costs of reward are a myth. These papers show that there's not even a phenomenon there, and roughly a third of you weren't listening, and that really troubles me, folks. If you're here for continuing education credits, then that means you're being certified to do things and to teach. And one of the things you're doing is going to be probably somewhere along the line teaching. This is important stuff. And you shouldn't be missing major points like this. So I hate to be scolding because I know that's aversive control, but if we're going to be doing professional things, we've got to be able to defend our field and justify what our field does. And our field works with reinforcers, and for us to have people going out there and saying, oh yeah, get rid of the artificial reinforcers, that's a bad thing to do with kids in the classroom. Well, what natural reinforcers are there for some of the kids that for the behavior that some of the kids have to present to their teachers in elementary schools, or for kids who have been having difficulty in their families because they're on the spectrum? You've got to know this, folks. The history is that this was a disastrous thing introduced by social psychologists, which has been taking us a half a century of fighting back on, and it's still pervasive out there, and you folks have to know that. So if you answered A and thought that reinforcers have hidden costs, then you've missed all of this literature, and I really refer you to it. It's important stuff to know. Now, we're going to move on to other kinds of topics, and these other topics are going to be significant and relevant to education as well. So if you're involved in teaching in any way, please hang in there. I'm going to be talking for a little while about some things that followed from a paper that Skinner wrote early on back in the 50s called The Science of Learning and the Art of Teaching. Because at that time, Skinner was trying to find a way of talking in terms of the stimuli that you present to the student, the responses the student makes, and the consequences that are produced. I mean, after all, it's the same old three-term contingency. And by the way, as you can tell from doing this, there's a lot of material here, and I'm gonna move quickly through some of it simply because of the amount of stuff that's here. Um, um, and So you all should have available among the handouts a download of this outline so that you could at least have some of the references there. So in that paper, Skinner said, some promising advances have recently been made in the field of learning. Special techniques have been designed to arrange what are called contingencies of reinforcement, the relations which prevail between behavior on the one hand and the consequences of that behavior on the other. Simply talking about the stuff we study all the time. Recent improvements in the conditions which control behavior in the field of learning are of two principal sorts. The law of effect has been taken seriously. What's the law of effect? That Skinner essentially, that reinforcement is a real phenomena. We've made sure that effects do occur and that they occur under conditions which are optimal for producing the changes called learning. So in Skinner's teaching machines, a question would come up. There'd be a way for a student to enter an answer that was well defined, and then the student could do something which would show whether that answer was correct. And by the way, one of the things that we do know is just acknowledgement that something is correct can be a reinforcer. If you've got students who are more advanced, who are in college courses, then just being able to write the answer down and then being told that you got the right answer has over time for most students come to make a difference. So that too is an important consequence. And the second important advance, Skinner said, permits us to maintain behavior for long periods of time, to find ways to keep behavior going, to make sure the reinforcers keep coming and are scheduled appropriately. So teaching machines was seen as tremendous innovations back in those days. And a lot of people just wanted to develop those machines. But, um, uh, oh, and I mentioned this, let me just finish this out. Many of these effects, Skinner says in that paper, would be traditionally assigned to the field of motivation, although the principal operation is simply the arrangement of contingencies of reinforcement. If you set things up so that the student is making progress, there's usually enough cumulative stuff going on that the reinforcers do become the ones that the social psychologists wanted them to be all along, which is the intrinsic stuff. And in fact, Skinner had a discussion and an interview with Alfie Kohn, who's the author of that book, Punished by Rewards, in which Kohn conceded afterwards that, yeah, Skinner actually agreed with a lot of the points he was making, because too often in the classroom, teachers are not making reinforcers or consequences contingent on correct answers and so forth. But Skinner was saying that these establishing operations are often, we do them just nothing more than the arrangement of reinforcement contingencies. Now, what are the underlying ideas here? Okay, what were these teaching machines supposed to do? Well, publishers jumped in and they started publishing books that were supposed to be teaching books, in which they would had things you could flip through, and you could answer a question on one page and see the answer on the next page, and some of them would direct you in different ways. There are still actually some very successful versions of these, one of which is still used in teaching neuroanatomy to medical students. It's by Sidman and Sidman. Sidman's brother was involved in that kind of teaching, and they put together a marvelous book which you could do on your own, which is essentially a programmed introduction to neuroanatomy. And since anatomy doesn't change too much over time, at least the gross anatomy, it's still a viable kind of a thing. But the publishers will also wanted to get these things done quickly, so they'd hire people who were to just put together these things without then running them over and over and over again, checking out each individual item to make sure, in fact, it was well constructed and that it was making a difference. And so these things came out. Now, imagine how different the world would be if back then they'd had computers. Computers would have made it easy to collect the data. It would have been easy to get things turned around. Nowadays, they're doing these teaching things, and there are all kinds of little programs that parents could buy that are supposed to teach the children math or reading or simple arithmetic and all sorts of things. But the problem is a lot of that stuff has not gone through the development that is necessary to make the stuff effective. But even the objectives were probably misconceived from the beginning, because if the idea is let's have one set of programs for economics and let's have another programs for biology and have another set of programs for history and so on, that's one way to think of it. Actually, those kinds of programs are ones that are going to be targeting kids who already come through elementary school and they've gotten into high school and maybe they haven't even learned good study skills. And this might begin to teach them that. But imagine a different thing. Imagine you start kids with a simple sequence of programs right from the beginning, in which they're advancing. At the beginning, they're working with learning letters and learning words. But after a while, they're learning sentences and paragraphs. And by the time they've gone through a few semesters of this, they're finally in chapters and books, and they can have questions there. Well, if the appropriate behavior has already been shaped by learning through a sequence of this, learning to handle individual letters, learning to handle sentences, and finally learning to handle chapters and books, the book itself is a very efficient teaching machine. And so the idea of teaching machines in those days was, let's use the teaching machines to get students to the place where they've learned good reading habits. They've learned to read things in certain ways. They've learned how to organize things for themselves. That's not the way the history has gone. But here we have after in the science of learning and the art of teaching, after Skinner discusses experiments on animals, psychophysics, other kinds of things, and he says, from this exciting prospect of an advancing science of learning, it is a great shock to turn to that branch of technology which is most directly concerned with the learning process, education. And he goes from there to talk about what education is like and what was for him then the contemporary classroom. And it's, as he discovered, it was filled with problems in which what were the innovations over the years? Well, they were always, you switch from blackboards to whiteboards and you get these presentation pads in which you could flip things over. They became popular in business. Then a great innovation, now we can show slides and later film strips. When I was a kid, being able to show a film strip in class, we were supposed to be entertained by that. Then later teachers could resort to showing movies and TV and computers. And all of these, what's going on? These are all changes in the way the teacher presents materials to student. It's about the teacher doing things and the student being there. Contemporary teaching concentrates too much on what the teacher does, not enough on what the student does. So that the sort of the motto seems to be, if you can't teach it, change it. But if it can't be taught, don't change how you teach it. Seems to be the leave it alone, keep on teaching the same old way you do, but now try teaching something different, change the curriculum. We couldn't get the kids to learn math by rote, so now let's try a different thing and we'll teach something we call the new math. We can't get the kids to learn to read by having them sound out the words. Now let's have them learn whole words. So in other words, the mantra in education over the years, and you can check this out in the history over the decades, if you can't teach them X, switch to Y instead, and maybe they'll learn it. That's the way we want to go. No, that's the wrong way for us to think about things. There's a different way, but let me give you one more example for the ways in which this can be misleading. When I was still teaching at UMBC, we had a guy in the biology department who was learning this use of clickers in the classroom. And these are not like the clickers you use to train your pets. This is not like Karen Pryor's clicker training things. No, this is the kind of thing where every student in the class has to go to the bookstore and buy this gadget in which they can enter a response as something the teacher's done. The teacher has a unit at the front of the class, so the teacher can ask a question, which is maybe a multiple choice question, and the students in the class then press one button or another, and the teacher can see which of the what the distribution of answers were, and find out how many students were getting it right and how many students were getting it wrong. So this guy in biology says, "Oh, Charlie, I'm really improving things out. These clickers are just doing wonders for my teaching, because when I started out, I'd ask a question and I get the feedback from the clickers, and I'd find that half the students in the class were missing it. So I changed my lectures and I fixed it up and made it clearer. And after giving the course 2 or 3 times, I now give the same material, and now just about every student in the class gets it." So this faculty member has come up with this thing in which he's now teaching the stuff in such a way that every student gets the correct answer right. And so what's happening is the teacher is doing more and the students are doing less. The teacher is doing everything the student needs to learn it, but the students are learning it maybe a pretty superficial way, because that happened just once in the classroom. One of the questions I never did get him to ask about was, well, what effect has that made on how your students are doing on their exams? Because the clicker feedback was used not to shape the behavior of the students in the class, not, for example, to then immediately come back to the material and then ask the question again a little bit later, and then ask the question a little bit later, so that you're shaping the behavior of the students in the classroom. But rather, this was a teacher who thought, I've just got to make my presentation better. Now, as you know here, and as I showed in my response to one of the earlier questions in the poll questions, I don't have much in the way of contingencies to shape your behavior. I hope you brought them here to this presentation. So having said that much, then what should happen? Oh, and one more example. Here's another kind of thing that happens. I'll make this real quick. Most teachers know that if students come into the class with a textbook and it's a pristine textbook, not very much time goes by before you pick up the student's book and you see that there's highlighting throughout it. Some things to ask students about highlighting. Is it appropriate to do it the first time you're reading something? Once you've highlighted it, do you remember it better because you highlighted it? And what are the consequences of highlighting? Turns out that mostly highlighting has a consequences that later the student saves time because they ignore the stuff they didn't highlight. But what if they didn't highlight the stuff that they really didn't learn yet? And how can it be a good thing not to highlight? So I've always made recommendations. I don't know how many students actually follow it. Don't put your highlighting on the page itself in a thing you can't erase. Do it in pencil in the margins. You can just put a little mark in the margins for a sentence that's important, or marking a word, or writing the word on the margin. And you can always modify it later, because the worst possible time to try to figure out what's important is the first time you read it. So there are all these kinds of things that involve what students do, and very few of them are based on a behavior analytic look at what the student's behavior is like. And is there relevant behavior about all of this stuff? Well, we know that time spent in the classroom does make a difference. There has been research done on student attendance. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Vance Hall was out of University of Kansas, was a high school principal, and he went back to get a degree in the what was then the behaviorally oriented department at Kansas, and then he went back to being involved with the schools, and he then collected some data and found that if you just took data on how much time in the math class the teacher spent talking to the kids and writing stuff on the board and all, and how much time the kids actually did arithmetic in the class, actually did additions or subtractions or whatever it was they were learning, that it turned out that that was a minuscule fraction of the class time. In a week, the teacher's presentation was maybe in the order of, if it was an hour-long class segment, a couple of hours or more. But the actual time in which the kids might be doing arithmetic in the classroom, the kids doing it, was a matter of minutes. The problem is, if you have the kids do a lot more, the teachers have to grade it, and teachers tend not to respond very well to taking on more and more assignments. They do, in fact, already have lots and lots to do, and there's a tendency to add more and more administrative stuff to their work. And if you add the administrative stuff, you can only take away the time from teaching, and that holds at the college level as well, by the way. So he finally made the deal with the teacher. Okay, don't worry about the grading. Just give them an extra 10 minutes once a day in the classroom in which they do arithmetic problems, but collect those and don't even bother grading them. You can just throw them away. Just grade the ones you always graded before. He had the teachers do that, and within a semester, kids were picking up on almost a term's level of competence, learning more arithmetic. Just getting them to behave in the classroom mattered. There was also, by the way, one of the biggest experiments in education that was ever done in the history of this country was the follow-through program done back in the 60s and the 70s, in which there were various components, some of which were designed, and each group had its own targets and criteria, some to build self-esteem and so forth. There were only 2 or 3 behavioral programs whose targets were competence in the classroom. And in fact, they did very well at that. But since the measures of self-esteem worked in the other things, most of the value of the follow-through program was never achieved in those days, even though all of the data pointed toward the kinds of behavior analytic ways that we have of doing things. So what conclusion can we draw from that? What a student learns is what the student does. The more we can get our students to do, the more they will learn, and we do our students no favors if instead we do things for them. This is just quoting from an early edition of my book. I was once surprised when a graduate student complained I hadn't provided outlines of the topics I was discussing in class. When I pointed out that each chapter in the text already had an outline, the student wasn't satisfied. This student was having the same problem as those educators who think that the behavior of the teacher matters more than the behavior of the student. Students who produce their own outlines learn much more than those who depend on outlines produced by their teachers. PowerPoint presentations are popular, but students who depend upon them are having things done for them rather than learning to do things themselves. That's really not what education is about that. For that reason, I was sorely tempted to omit chapter outlines and keywords. I thought I might be doing no favor for my readers by including them. And by the way, I use this as an excuse to tell colleagues, if the student comes and says, gee, you really should have put outlines up for us in the Blackboard online unit or whatever, turn around to the student and say, well, read that paragraph in the text. I really can't do that, or otherwise I would not be a responsible teacher. It's hard these days, though, because the criteria for getting evaluations for young faculty members to move on and so on are making it more and more a problem of consumer satisfaction rather than being able to measure outcomes. So why should you make outlines for them? They should be able to make outlines themselves. Why give them copies of visual materials that we designed when they can make their own copies? Why always simplify when they can do some of it? Why reduce the required reading? When I was an undergraduate in that experimental psych course that Nat Schoenfeld taught in the spring semester of my junior year, we read all of Skinner's Behavior of Organisms and we read all of Hull's Principles of Behavior. And the idea that you'd even conceive of assigning behavioral organisms these days is minimal. Many of the uh, uh, versions people have used the text that I showed, even though it comes in a reasonable number of pages for a semester, 300 pages. If you're talking about a 15-week semester, that comes out to 20 pages a week that you're asking students to read. And yet some faculty members say there's too much material in there, I can only cover part of the book. The students are doing less in classroom, and we should not be surprised if for that reason that they are learning less. Contemporary teaching concentrates too much on what the teacher does, not enough on what the student does. Remember, what the student does is what the students learn. Students are not vessels into which we pour knowledge, and yet that remains a metaphor that many faculty members, especially those in other disciplines, assume. They're there to just pour things into their students. And if we can't teach it, we shouldn't change the curriculum. We should figure out how to teach it. We should be able to teach rote stuff and make it fun. If that's what you have to learn, then it's not bad to know a little bit about math facts or arithmetic facts. It's not a bad thing to know some definitions so you can rattle them off. And the idea that we started with when I talked about teaching my brother some algebra, teach it in as many different ways. And then if you don't have to think that rote is the only thing you can do. But if you're teaching something which has some explicit material in it, you can do some rote teaching. You could teach them teaching by discovery. You can find 5 or 6 different ways in which a student can do it. Once a student can do it in all those different ways, that's when you really know you've been effective in teaching it. So remember, what the student does is what the student learns, and don't change the curriculum, change how you teach them. Yes, that's the way we should go. And now let's have a poll question about this one.
Alrighty, everybody. Historically, most
And excuse me, while you're doing that poll question, let everybody take a 2-minute break, and I'll be right back, okay? But I do want to see what the answers are.
Sure. All right. So, everybody, historically, most educational innovations have involved go ahead and take a couple of minutes. We'll give this the entire break. I'll just leave it up.
Okay. So how did they do?
Alrighty, let's see. Looks like 55% say ways teachers present materials to students, 3% say arranging contingencies for student learning, 39% say both A and B, and 3% say neither.
Well, okay, not too bad, but there's not. I guess it depends on whether you think that the fact that a few of us are doing the second one, and if you took that and some of us do it in our educational systems, then I guess you could say either of those would be correct. So I'll give you a pass, everybody. Um, so let's move. Let's continue to move on. We're not doing too badly. We've actually covered a real lot of ground, actually. Um, so anyway, to recapitulate then, what the student learns is what the student does. Students should ask not what teachers can do for them, but rather what they can do for themselves. And those of you who have been around long enough know that that echoes a quotation from the one of the presidential addresses from Jack Kennedy. Students who produce their own outlines learn much more than those who depend on outlines produced by their teachers. Textbook authors who provide many chapter outlines and keywords may be doing no favors for their readers. Um, the the Marissa knows that before we did this, we got a couple of comments or questions coming from people who weren't behavior analysts who wondered whether there might be any messages in here that would be useful for parents or others who are worried about student learning who are not behavior analysts. And I would say that this particular slide incorporates most of that. If you've got a child, um, your tendency might be that you do most of the talking and tell the child what they're supposed to know, but you want to get the child talking. And so the most important point then, the most general point that we behavior analysts then would stress is that it's the student behavior we care about, not the teacher behavior. And too often the teacher takes over and is talking at the child and so forth when getting the learner to do things in the end is the most important thing you can do. Children learn what they do. Um, Once they're doing math problems, they're learning to do math problems. Um, if they're just sitting there and you're running through math problems and putting the answers down for them, that is nowhere near as effective as having the child do it. So where else can we go? Some ways, if you're at the university level, some of you might still be, um, whether you have practices or whether you're involved in all sorts of other things, you may occasionally be giving courses. If you do have to work within academic courses, what are the ways to get students to do more? You give exams. If you could even design exams which in which students can learn by taking them because they if you have questions ordered in certain ways, You can require that they can take quizzes online. You can require essays. You can require attendance. You can require lab work and computer simulations. All of these are things that you can get to have the students spend more time. So now I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which we can do research. That I had a longtime colleague, unfortunately lost him some time ago, but he and I worked together uh, for decades at UMBC, and to the point where we team taught some courses, the learning course mainly. And Elliot discovered that although for most research you have to go through the internal review board and get approval, if you're doing experiments in the classroom and the things that you were doing were things that you do in the classroom anyway, and you were mainly collecting data, you didn't have to get IRB approval ahead of time to do it. You had to report what you were doing and that you were going to use the data for research and so forth. But you could streamline things and get this stuff done a lot more easily. So he ended up doing experiments in the classroom. And I want to describe just a couple of them, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that can make a difference. And this is a vehicle for doing, for those of you who are in teaching positions and you're wondering about getting publications and all, it's a way to do it and to combine your teaching with research so as to be productive in both ways. And goodness knows, look at all the things we're talking about. There's plenty to be done, whether you're talking about the college classroom or classrooms at any level. So I'm going to show you a figure first. So here's what happens at the beginning of the semester, and this is Elliot teaching his intro course. Beginning of the semester, he divides the class into two groups. They're all assigned seats in a big intro classroom. And then the students sitting on one side of the room are told they're in one group in which no attendance will be taken. The students sitting in the other half of the room are told that their attendance will be taken. If a warm body is sitting in that seat, then the student be listed as having attended that class. If that seat is empty, the student will be listed as not having attended. But these are just being done for experimental purposes. They will have no influence whatsoever on grades. You won't be penalized in any way if you're absent from class, and that's true for both groups. And this, after that experiment, which involved a fairly large number of students, I maybe should have put the student number of students in here. This is the grade distribution. There was an incomplete. There were some students who failed the course and some students who got D's and C's. But if you look at the upper end, the students who got A's, the filled bar here shows that the number of students who, actually you can infer the numbers by just reading over here. You had more students in the attendance taken group than the attendance not taken group who got A's who got A's. More from the attendance taken group. If you look at the D's, once again, many more students if they were in the attendance taken group than in the other group. Reversed, students were much more likely to get a C if their attendance were in the not taken group. Now, remember, this was random assignment at the beginning of the semester, and yet just taking attendance makes a difference. Now, what can we assume about that? The students didn't believe the instruction that it wouldn't matter to their grades. The students for whom attendance was taken also were more likely to attend. So the other underlying difference between these groups is simply that the attendance taking group spent more time in the classroom listening to the instructor or listening to what was going on in class than the students who were in the group in which attendance was not taken. And I think it's not a difficult inference to make that just being in class a little bit more often can be enough to make a difference in the grade. And if you average these up, it comes to a very substantial fraction of a letter grade. for having been in the one group than the other. One of the ironies of this study, by the way, was that one of the reviewers of the article, who's published in the Teaching of Psychology, said that since the students in the one group were disadvantaged relative to the students in the other group, um, it was unethical to do this kind of research. I think what it would be possible to say is it is unethical not to take attendance, since you know that if you take attendance, students will get better grades. Except to do that in a college level course is sometimes regarded as an issue, even though you know that the thing has an effect. The other thing in any case was that Elliot took all the grades and gave them grades and adjusted them based on which group they were in, so that kind of overrides the. It's a strange thing to say that if you do an experiment on learning in the classroom at the college level and it shows an effect on grades, and the students in the one group then were disadvantaged relative to the other, that therefore that was an unethical thing to do. So the only ethical experiments you can do are the ones which show no effect. I don't think I'd go along with that. Fortunately, the other editors and the other reviewers didn't agree with that particular reviewer. Well, we did, and by the way, this was collaborative work. Although I wasn't teaching as intro course, we talked a lot about what we were doing. These are data from a different kind of experiment. This was one in which we had the students, again in an intro course, take quizzes online, and ahead of time, they could take what we call practice quizzes. They could just go online, and there'd be a population of maybe 100 or 150 questions for a given unit in the course, and they could go in and each quiz randomly drew 10 questions, or 20 items, whatever, and they could keep going, and they would get credit for having completed this quiz once they got say 18 out of 20, or else if they were in another group with a lower criterion, once they got 10 out of 20. And if you do that, then you find that this is how their scores work on the practice quizzes. And actually, I've got this accidentally got swapped with another graph. So it turns out that the results are very similar to the results I showed you in the first graph. I'll fix that later, but unfortunately not while we're on. I won't try to do that while we're talking here. But there again, just having students work to a higher criterion to assign a higher grade, the more we ask from students, the more they do. And it turns out that too is correlated with grades. So once again, we have evidence that the more the students do, the more they learn, if grades and correct answers are taken as a measure of student performance. Anyway, with all of that, let's ask one more question of you folks.
Alrighty, everybody. So a good way to think about teaching is, and go ahead and take some time to answer this one.
By the way, the is in the middle of B, I'd say that you could read that what students learn is what they do is the same as saying what students do is what they learn. Consider those equivalent.
Alrighty. Thank you for voting. Let's see. It looks like 2% say students are vessels into which we pour into knowledge. 81% say what students learn is what they do. 17% say both A and B, and no one said neither.
Okay. Well, the majority has it, that's for sure. Okay. So let's move on a bit now, and I'm gonna start talking in some more general terms for a little bit. Now remember, this is a culmination of thinking about what we know about learning, and so especially since Elliot Shimoff and I had collected these data now, we then did build a learning course at UMBC in which we deliberately put in as many different ways of getting the students to spend time. Of course, exams matter. If you give exams, students spend a certain amount of time studying for them, some more, some less. The other interesting thing is that the time they spend studying is distributed during the semester. Um, uh, and it's distributed based on when the exams are. There's a marvelous set of experiments, again, these were published way back, I think in the 70s, by Ken Lloyd. I believe he was at Washington, the University of Washington at the time, or maybe still was throughout this. And it was simply you'd have one room, which was the only room where you had study materials for the course, so that you'd actually have students come in. This is just like going to a doctor's office and you sign in at the beginning and you put the time that you arrived, and then you sign out, put the time that you left, or punching a clock. And so they actually had a semester and they actually clocked the time the students spent in that room, which was the only place where the study materials were for this particular course. And this was, by the way, things like these were all resident students. It wasn't like they were commuters where, you have all kinds of worries about getting to the room. Then you compare what happens if you have just a midterm and a final with what happens if you have shorter exams distributed every week or two throughout the semester, so they have 10 separate exams, same number of questions distributed in different ways. Well, if you have just a midterm and a final, would any of you be surprised to learn that at the beginning of the course, the students aren't spending much time in that room? But as the midterm approaches, more and more of them go to the room and more of them spend more time there. So if you're drawing a cumulative curve of the time that they spend in the room, you'll see it going up and up and up until you get to the time of the exam, of that midterm exam, and then the students take the exam. Then immediately after the exam, guess what? No surprise, it drops down again to near zero. And then the semester continues. And this time again, you see it accumulating. You see more and more as time passes, the students increasing the time they spend studying, or at least in that room with the materials they can study for the exam. And then the exam is given and it's all over. By the way, they spend more time in the lead up to the final exam than they do in the lead up to the midterm exam. Now look at the other group. What you get is a similar effect over the shorter time periods leading up to each of these shorter exams, 10 of them, 12 of them, whatever it turned out, that I don't remember the exact number in Ken Lloyd's design. And they tend to get bigger and bigger, the total amount of time, as you move through the course, so that for the last exam, it's the more students studying. But now you can do one more thing. You essentially measure the area under the curve for the two conditions, the area under the curve, the total time spent, all the time spent on average for the class as a whole, studying when you have just a midterm and a final, and all the time spent when you have these distributed shorter exams throughout the semester. And what you find is a very substantially larger amount of time spent if you space out shorter exams throughout the semester. Maybe 30, maybe 40% more time spent in that room actually studying. So the message, if you're going to give exams, don't just give a midterm and a final. If you want to keep if your understanding is the more you get the students to do, the more they're going to learn, then if you give them frequent, shorter in-class exams, they will spend more time studying. You can do the same with quizzes online, which they have to do. You can do the same by having them write brief essays. And here again, we had to worry about ways to get this managed. We had one very, very large class. There was no way a teaching assistant could grade regular brief essays in a class of 150 students and have these happen once a week, especially if you wanted any kind of. So we ended up with very simple kinds of essay questions, like what is the difference between reinforcement and punishment? The ideal answer would be reinforcement makes behavior go up, punishment makes behavior go down. And that was the kind of answer we were looking for. But when we had students do these online, if they entered an answer, they then had an opportunity to see a thing to compare their answer with, and it would be a question like, did you talk about behavior going up or down? And then the student had the opportunity to revise. And then after they revised that, did you talk about which way it went for reinforcement and which way it went for punishment? And then they could revise again. And maybe by that time, for all we know, since it was online, they could have been looking at the textbook. And then so all of the questions were straightforward and fairly simple, and made it very, very easy for us to evaluate them on an all or none basis. The student either got full credit or not, because with questions like that, it's a pretty straightforward thing to answer. But we then did one other kind of thing. We had several of these, like 2 or 3 or 4 every week, but within each group, the teaching assistant graded and gave points toward the grade, just one of them. And we didn't grade all of the sets every week because it just wouldn't have been feasible for the teaching assistant would have been spending full time just doing these kinds of things. Nevertheless, most students, given these contingencies, finished virtually all of them, and they tended to give it, and we did then take samples, and they tended to do well on the ones we didn't grade as well as the ones we graded. So this is a way of kind of minimizing faculty and TA time, and yet getting the students to do as much as possible to learn the material. And of course, there were computer simulations. We also asked them to do recordings of the time they spent working on the course, lots of stuff. And then, of course, if you take attendance, which we didn't in this particular thing, that would have made a difference too, because in-class demonstrations might have mattered. So the self-reports, well, the students reported more or less time spent on studying in their time logs, and it was poorly correlated with the points they earned on quizzes. These are just scatter plots. The time they spent completing essays online were not much correlated with the points they earned. But if we looked at the number of words generated, which is a measure of how much they did, then we began to see a positive correlation. And even though this is a thing that's limited data because it's from one course, they tended to do better on quizzes if they had done more online essays. And they tended to do better on quizzes if they had done more computer work. So what we were seeing was the more we had them do, and it doesn't hardly matter what it was we had them do, just like it doesn't matter whether you teach the distributive law in algebra by rote or by definition or by examples or by getting to do more is by giving examples, requiring quizzes, retiring attendance. All of these things are ways to get the students to do more. The bottom line of this is we could worry about presentation, and of course we should. There are no doubt some better ways and orders in which to present material than others. But any way you can figure to get the students to spend more time with the material, and even better, to do it in a non-aversive way, the more the students are going to learn. And there's way, way more. As our technology improves with computers and so forth, we're not limited to these alternatives. For example, there's fluency training, which is essentially overlearning and learning to give quick answers. It turns out that students are more likely to bring together material from different things if they're really fluent in all of the aspects of it. There's a huge literature there. I invite you to do that. Interactive stuff and interactive experiments, more extensive incorporation of shaping and fading when we do computer things, using schedules to stretch performance out, generalized skills, and it is not inappropriate to try to teach study behavior so they get students to the point of getting to the things we call books. And now we got ebooks, of course. Um, I have not incorporated in here anything about AI materials, but even those could be used because you could have students giving questions to an AI, one of these current AI systems, and then have the students write an essay critiquing the answers that the AI gave. And yes, those are problems now, whether you're really grading the student's performance or really grading something else. But that makes the other kinds of learning situations even more important. Teach them how to do shaping with computer simulations or preferably with real organisms. Teach them how to do these kinds of things. And I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about some of the non-behavior analytic literature, which supports our conclusions. There's a whole bunch of research on what are called learning styles. You supposedly have some people who are visual learners and some people who are auditory learners. And so at one point I became more and more interested in this and began to come up again and again. And you had students who would be coming up and asking for special ways in which you will treat them because they have problems with learning this way or that way. And even though there are lots of different anecdotal reports, if you go into the literature, there is not a persuasive body of evidence that suggests that learning styles matter. And this may surprise you. If it does, all I can do is refer you to this literature. Um, by the way, this paper is one that comes from non-behavior analytic literature. This is somebody who's not a behavior analyst, promising directions from cognitive and educational psychology. And if you start looking into that kind of literature, you find that the recommendations are all about what the student does. Very little of this has to do with changing what the teacher does. So it's really reassuring to see that somebody coming from a totally different perspective is reaching the same kinds of conclusions. Virtually all the examples Nosky present and co-authors present involve student behavior, not teacher behavior, whether it's self-explanation, writing summaries, doing some imagery stuff, doing mnemonics, distributing your practice, and so forth. Some of these fare better than others, and roughly, if you look at that literature, those requiring more behavior work better than those requiring less. If you want to teach, get the learner to do more, and then the job is, once the learner is doing, then you should be able to shape what the learner does if you know anything at all about what the reinforcers are. Here's another one, and this is the benefits of testing. And some of this is stuff that we might be worried about. Testing produces better organization of knowledge. It improves transfer, metacognitive monitoring, prevents interference from prior material when learning new material. These are sort of the kinds of things you get when you get other approaches. My reason for putting this here is to give you the suggestion that it might be very interesting for somebody coming at this from a behavioral point of view to look at these. And if in fact these are database-based benefits, to essentially translate this into terminology which tells the teacher what they should do in order to get the students to behave differently within these criteria. And then here's another one, principle of instructors, research-based strategies. Begin a lesson with a short review. Now this one then is, notice, you begin the lesson. This is about what the teacher does. Present new material in small steps. That's still about what the teacher does, but at least it's changing something. Ask a large number of questions and check the responses of all the students. Now that's important. Don't just ask the questions, but see what the students did. Provide models. This one doesn't say what that is. Some of these are just totally ambiguous. These things, by the way, some of the ways in which I got to this was through Marshall Dermer and the Teaching of Behavior Analysis list. Those of you who are interested in this kind of stuff, ABA has special interest groups. One of them is the Teaching of Behavior Analysis, and they have a listserv which is free to sign on to, and that's a good place to find discussions of all these sorts of things. So with that, let's have one more poll question. Here we go.
Hey everybody. Sorry about that. I had a pop-up that wouldn't go away. Alrighty, here we go. In college courses, which of the following affects final grades?
I hope this one's easy.
Alrighty, please keep in mind that these are a requirement if you need CEU, so please, please, please make sure you participate. Otherwise, you could not qualify. Awesome. Let's shut this down. It looks like 31% say taking attendance, 7% say requiring minimum scores on online quizzes, 54% say both, and 7% say neither.
Okay, well, C was the correct answer, so I'm glad to see that that was the majority in the answer group. Okay, we have, I guess we're getting well into our time. So let me close off. There are still other things we could talk about. As I've already mentioned, this is a huge topic. The I just want to finish off with a little bit of an example of some other kind of educational research. And this is involved more with the distinction between verbally governed behavior and behavior that's been shaped by contingencies. I mentioned earlier on the research with Nancy Neef and her graduate students at Ohio State. And there we were concerned more with the behavior of the teacher because they had looked at those schools and saw that there were some of these teachers who were just ignoring correct answers on the part of the child, and where the teachers reacted more to the mistakes that the kids made. But we also wanted to see if we could do something experimentally, and the question is, how do you teach teachers who have been taught something very different historically, and you want to change how they do things in the classroom? So we've typically found that if you're looking at human behavior, not looking at non-human behavior, I'm talking about people. If you're looking at the behavior of people and you look at what they do, you find that actually if you're arranging contingencies, sometimes those contingencies don't work very well. Contingencies shape behavior sometimes can be very insensitive to what the consequences are. And that's because people are often asked to follow directions. And you're usually not told what to do unless you wouldn't have done it otherwise. Nobody tells you to do things you're going to do anyway. They tell you to do things that the natural contingencies would have led you not to do. So if the natural contingencies working on the behavior of a kid are get outside to play with your friends as quick as you can, then you've got to stop the kid from doing that to get the kid to put on boots or something if it's wet out there or something like that, or to put on something warmer if it's cold out there. So instructions typically have to override natural contingencies because that's when we usually offer instructions. And instructions, of course, are the verbal strings that govern behavior. Now, when we want to change the behavior of teachers, we could tell them what to do, or we could try to shape what they say. And Nancy Neef and the students there, we wanted to find some ways of seeing whether we could go somewhere with this kind of thing. Now, if we're looking at the learner, that's one thing because we're looking at shaping there, but but we were interested in the teachers, and they had to come up with something that was concrete enough that it would make it easy for us to work on verbal behavior. And one of the things they came up with is really also relevant to us today. It was with respect to this distinction between general praise or specific praise in the classroom. And an example of that is, good job, everybody. That's an example of general praise. An example of specific praise is, uh, uh, Becky, you got that answer right. Or Jimmy, I like that sentence you wrote. And the difference between those two is that if you say good job, um, that's something you could say to just about any kid. And if you got a big class of 30 or 40 kids and you say good job to the class, maybe you're responding to the 3 or 4 kids who are always making eye contact with you and you tend to look at all the time, and you did see that they were doing something. But for most of the other kids in the class, they were maybe talking to the kid next to them, or they were doing something else, or not really paying much attention to you. And all of those kids, including the ones you were looking at, have learned over time that when you say good job, it doesn't necessarily depend on anything that they did. Maybe it depends on something some kids in the class did, but the relationship between good job and their behavior is a kind of chancy one. But if you say that to Becky, and Becky has just done this math problem and has just answered it, and you say you got the right answer, Becky is responding to something where the teacher is paying attention to Becky. Similarly, Jimmy has written this sentence, and you've said, Jimmy, I like the sentence you wrote. And Jimmy, the teacher's behavior there is directed to Jimmy. So specific praise actually is more effective in the classroom. And there's a literature on this on the part of the teaching things, but I don't think they spelled out why that is the case. It is the case because of the dynamics of this. And if you've ever been in a big group, I mean, I used to do a swim class, and the swim instructor would be on the side of the pool, and there'd be all of us doing our moves. And a thing I did was deep water fitness. And every once in a while, the swim instructor would be looking over the class and saying, good job, everybody. Well, seeing how everybody's legs were moving under the water isn't likely an easy thing to do. And most people in that class knew. And besides, we were adults, and it seemed a little bit strange. But in general, then, if we adults feel a little bit funny about being told good job, imagine how it is if you're a kid in a classroom, and that's mainly the kind of feedback that the teacher gives rather than giving feedback to the individual kids. Of course, it's difficult. If you've got 40 kids in the class, you can't manage all of them, especially if you've got college students and you got to keep track of their names and their pronouns and clothes they're wearing and where they're sitting, and all the kinds of things that make you recognize one student and not another student. That's a tough job to keep track of all the kids. I mentioned specifically what they were. I used to try to learn the names of students in the class, but if I had a big class, and I'd finally learn the name of the student, and then the next day the student would wear something different and sit in a different seat. And that threw away some of the basis in which I was learning the name of this student rather than the other student. But I am at least retired from that kind of teaching, although I value it enough that I'm doing a bit of it here, except that I cannot make the individual contact with you folks like as I used to be able to in the classroom. Anyway, Nancy and her students had identified this difference between general praise and specific praise, and also knew that the literature said that specific praise makes things go better. Students in the classroom do better if the consequence of getting the right answer is specific praise than if it's general praise. So what we did was we worked with the teachers, and what we did was gave them questionnaires which were about what they do in the classroom, and had them write out a little something about specific praise and what they did when students gave right answers. And then differentially reinforced the teachers saying something about specific praise. So on the left side of this graph, you can see that once that shaping of praise began, Shep, one of the, so that's, these are artificial, these are not the names of the actual teachers, gradually said something about giving specific praise and said less and less about giving general praise. That happened with respect to Abe, who did mention it occasionally, but now began to mention it more specifically. And we did the same with Bill. And so in both of these cases, in all three of these cases, our differential reinforcement of what they said about what they were going to be doing in the classroom raised the likelihood of their talking about specific praise. Now, at the same time, after a session of doing the questionnaire, Shep went into the classroom and we recorded Shep's behavior there. And then after the next one, we went and recorded his behavior in the classroom and so forth. So the vertical line here corresponds to the shift to shaping. And once we had switched the shaping of saying something about specific praise, we found that this teacher increased specific praise in the classroom. Enough so that when we then discontinued the shaping and just let things go, that teacher continued to do that in the classroom for a while. Now, we don't know how long it would have gone on. There were limits. We were actually reaching the end of the school year. But notice that a similar pattern shows for all of the others. Abe, once the shaping began, increased specific praise in the classroom, having said something about specific praise is what I should do in the classroom, and continued after that contingency stopped, after the shaping ended. And the same is true of Bill. So in all three of these cases, shaping the verbal behavior, a lot better than trying to go into the classroom and saying, great teacher, you just use specific praise. You can't go into the classroom and do that. The only practical thing to do is to do it outside the classroom. But ours, and what we would have done had we had the resources, would have been to compare this with telling the teachers that they ought to use specific praise more in the classroom, and then doing a measure to see. A lot of other research on the shaping of verbal behavior has suggested to us that shaping what they say is more likely to change the teacher's behavior than telling the teacher what to do. And so these are other kinds of things you can think about. If you want to work on adult human behavior, if you're not working with special populations where you got a problem with verbal governance and so forth, then this might not be the way to go. One of the places we see that as a possible innovation, and if anybody has an opportunity to do it, if you work in a place in which you have the job of teaching parents how to work with their child on the autism spectrum, these parents are coming in, they don't know our field, they may have suspicions about it, and you want to teach them. Well, one of the things you can do is teaching those parents is to talk to them and to do things the way we do a lot of other teaching, and you be the teacher and you're not looking at their behavior. But another is to get them to talk about it and then shape what they say about what they're going to be doing with the child. And it's not easy. It takes a little bit of history with respect to, if you've never done verbal shaping, don't expect to be able to jump right into it. But if any of you out there are interested in pursuing that, I recommend you perhaps get in touch with Nancy, get in touch with me. My email is catania@umbc.edu. Love to see more research on this kind of thing because we think it's the kind of thing that can make a difference. And so, for example, can work to counteract some of those prejudices like the hidden cost of reward and some of the other things that mess up the status of contemporary education today. So we did manage to, we're running close to we're actually close to the end of our time. I do want to leave any chance for questions, but at this point, just one more thing. I need feedback. So here's one last question for you.
Alrighty, everybody. So, do you have questions for the presenter? Yes, several, just one, maybe, or no? If so, go ahead and answer this and then throw them into the questions box. We'll have some time for Q&A. Awesome. Thank you so much. I do believe that yes, I am getting some feedback that I think we ran over time. We did run over time so far for 10 minutes, but that is okay. If you had somewhere to go, that is fine. If you stayed the whole time, you can let your coworkers or friends know that they still qualified if they stayed and missed the last 10 minutes. That's totally okay. We appreciate you all for staying so far. We're just continuing the show just because there's things to learn. But alrighty, let's shut this down. And it looks like 6% say several, 5% say one, 19% say maybe, 70% say nope.
Oh, okay. It was that clear, huh? There was a lot of material there. So anyway, okay, let's see if we have any questions.
Alrighty, so let's see. How do you feel like behavior analysts can get a seat at the table in the educational establishment?
Well, I think in ways we're already doing. There are positions occasionally that become open in teachers' colleges, for example. I mentioned Doug Greer earlier, and that is infiltrating its way into teaching and other things. And Doug is simply amazing because he's turned out the number of doctorates out of his program at Teachers College at Columbia is actually in three-digit figures. I forget whether it's even over 200. I mean, he's been doing that for a long time. It's a remarkable achievement. Um, and it's called the Fred Keller School, if I recall rightly. And there are other places where people are looking at education. Uh, I Now the problem is uh, it's harder in some places than in others. I know, for example, that Claire St. Peter at West Virginia was working on a program in which teachers would learn some basics about elementary school, and the teachers in some schools, and maybe it was, I don't remember right now whether it was elementary school, middle school, high school, but it was at one of those levels. But these teachers would then spread out to other areas, to other counties, and then do tutorials. And the idea was that the teachers would teach each other and it would gradually expand out into the state. So if you've got a model like that, that would be one way of doing it. Another example that occurs to me is in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, they've got, I've forgotten the acronym right now, but there is a system for special ed teaching throughout the state of Pennsylvania with central organization. They run the National Autism Conference up at Penn State University every year. I've attended some of those. And at one of the recent ones, uh, one of the directors of the program was saying, well, you know, now throughout the state, we've got all of these places which are accredited for teaching children on the spectrum. We're getting better and better resources in place. And you know what? If we can teach something to a child who's really got a serious problem, is on the spectrum, we should be able to teach any kid. And the idea then is to take some of the things we've learned about teaching and apply it to education in general in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, at least it's got the history of being fairly well received politically. I don't know what happens in states where you've got a lot of resistance to this kind of stuff. If you want to do it in Utah, I don't know. If you want to do it in Florida or Texas, I don't know. If you want to do it in a state that has a museum of Noah's Ark, in which you can look at all of the history of the flood and all as if it was something that really happened. I don't know. But in states that do have some history with respect to this, then getting it started in some places and making a difference matters. Getting the data out there, getting things published, and part of it is just overriding a long problematic history of misrepresentations um, in which behavior analysis was seen as controlling. That word control of behavior has haunted us. Um, Lovaas using punishment in his early, what he called applied behavioral analysis, has continued to be troublesome because there are parents who have heard of what some special ed teachers call ABA PTSD parents, whose then young children on the spectrum were treated with aversive control, and apparently that left enough problems that now that those children are adults, that those parents still look with suspicion, not recognizing that what we're doing is really very, very different from what Lovaas recommended um, long ago. But he got a lot of publicity, articles in major magazines like Life magazine and so forth. And we're still paying the price for that kind of proliferation of notions about what the basics are of what we do. There's still people who think about what we do that's consistent with what behavior analysis was like in the 50s and 60s. And thinking about this kind of thing really drives home to me what a long way we've come. We really do think about a lot of basic things in a very different way than people talked about way back then. We've done a lot. We've learned a lot. A lot of it is new. And people who've been around for 30, 40 years and who think that they can go back to their textbook from their intro course back then or the basic course back then, and that's all they need to do to be up to date, they're mistaken. We have to build what's new. And that's why books go through new editions. Um, that will help some. So it's a great big problem. We're talking about incredibly large numbers, entrenched bureaucracies. We're talking about money because um, it seems like you cannot stop the continuing increase of larger and larger class sizes when we know that what we need to do is to have more one-on-one and more reduction so that the teacher can give time to individual children rather than to big classes. So we've got a huge problem. And I remind you how I started out uh, early on with that terrible warning from H.G. Wells. Yes, we're in that race. And it's not just a race with climate change and with a whole bunch of other political things and a race for uh, fascist governments versus democracy. But education has got to be at the heart of it all. So as you can, I hope you can tell, I feel rather strongly about this stuff. And it's where I started. It started with these guys. And now it's not just guys, a lot of, as I mentioned, Nancy Neef, Claire St. Peter, a lot of women have done a lot in the field too. And so we've got a huge, we got a ways to go yet, but we've improved a lot with respect to diversity. And certainly that's important as we move into education too. So we've got a big job ahead of us, but we've also got a lot of good precedents. So let's hope it continues to go well.
All
Thank you
right.
again for listening.
Yeah. Did you want to take more questions or?
Yeah, sure. I have a few more. I can do that.
Okay, awesome. Sweet. So let's see. I wonder if you give ChatGPT an essay question and an ideal response, could ChatGPT subsequently accurately evaluate and grade student responses? What are your thoughts?
Oh my. I I have misgivings about that because the kinds of responses you want, I mean, teaching the fundamentals by rote is one thing, but you wouldn't want to stop there. Just as I wouldn't have wanted to stop if all my brother could have done was, I write down x parenthesis y plus z close parenthesis, and I want him to write down xy plus xz. Um, if that was the only thing he could do, yeah, uh, uh, ChatGPT could do that, could probably do that kind of thing. But I didn't want him to do just that. I wanted to be able to deal with a novel problem, and I'd be wary about depending too much on the. I think I want to keep the shaping and the judgments in the hands of humans, of the hands of organisms. We don't know enough. After all, what these. Well, let me do that. Let me answer that more specifically. There was this Jeopardy contest in which Ken Jennings and one of the other long-term champions in Jeopardy were pitted against Watson, which was the name of the massive computer that IBM put together. And so they did this Jeopardy show, and Watson, the computer, beat these two humans who had done so well on Jeopardy over all this time. But these computers were essentially like one of us having access to search on the web. Now that is the incredibly amazing thing that the web can now do. It can do these incredibly fast searches and come up with things that we could not bring up when doing searches in other ways. But they also gave Watson, the computer, a short reaction time. And they gave the humans no special, their reaction time was whatever a human does, the time it takes to press their button to give their answer. If they had given a slightly longer reaction time to Watson, the humans would have won, because in fact it was close. But they apparently tailored this to a reaction time by a computer, which is essentially like a competition between you and me, and I can go use Google to search on the web for the answer, but you can't. Okay, you've got to come up with it on your own. And if I've got access to that, that's the kind of access that Watson had, because it was a whole bunch of computers yoked together, and they provided the database for the search. So the idea that Watson somehow was doing something special and beating these humans is just nonsense. Really, literally, I mean, it was nonsense, because the kinds of mistakes that Watson made, when Watson made mistakes, were not unlike anything that a human would have made. So, for example, there was one about airports and World War II. Well, the Chicago airport is named Midway, and it's named Midway in honor of the Battle of Midway in the Pacific during World War II. And that was this one where the Japanese were coming out, and the American aircraft carrier group sank 3 out of the 4 Japanese carriers, and that was the turning point in the war in the Pacific. Anybody familiar with World War II history and sort of running through those things would come up with Midway as an answer, and the humans did, but they were slow. But Watson came up with a weird answer, and it's not even clear how, why that happened. And there were some others that were very weird answers. Now, the way the chat GPT would work is it's also got this massive database. It's like exploring the Google universe or whichever search engine you're working with, and coming up with things in which some of these things happen to be in juxtaposition. So it pulls paragraphs from this work and paragraphs from that work and begins putting them together. That is not the way intelligence works. And people have done curious things like asking GPT questions about itself that end up with rather some bizarre results. I would not want to see that substituting for a human, because it is not dealing with things in the same way that we do. They have a thing that works because it got a massive, massive database, and it can do it very, very quickly, but it is not working in the same way that we do. And it's unfortunate that intelligence was the label slapped onto this, because it is not intelligence that's like a human intelligence at all. It is an artificial intelligence, but it's doing it differently. So yeah, we're going to learn to live with it. We have to. But the thing that I worry the most is giving too much control to these AI systems without the human intervention. I would hate to see somebody trying to develop a thing that's going to have um, the AI decide whether or not we should launch missiles um, or something like that, because I think that would be disastrous. Um, but of course, humans can make mistakes too, but obviously we know that. So it's probably not a satisfactory answer. I've probably gone on too long, but that's my best guess or where I stand right now, at least. But thanks for the question. It's a good one. It's an important one.
Alrighty, let's see. Did you want to take another or?
Let's make it one more, unless you see more in the queue um, that you think we ought to. But I think we ought to wrap up.
Alrighty, last one. Let's do. Do you recommend any? Do you have any recommended literature for shaping parents' verbal behavior in regards to using specific versus general praise?
That's no, because that's just developing. I can, let's see, I cannot quickly and easily find the citation. Well, let's see. Um, yeah, the, so you should be able to access this journal article, the Journal of Behavioral Education, and the reference list there does have some of the relevant literature that Nancy uh, pulled together that upon which we based it, and the discussion and introduction do have some discussion of it. So I'd at least start there. She is far more fluent and expert on this topic than I am. Uh, but and the other thing is, if you're unsuccessful with that, or you can't get a copy you can download of this, for everybody, it's Catania, as my last name is spelled, C-A-T like in cat, A-N-I-A. You got it there at UMBC. That's short for University of Maryland, Baltimore County .edu. Catania at umbc.edu. Send me an email. I can send you a link to or I can send you a copy of the manuscript. Um, those of you who are still on, who did have questions that I'm not getting to, send them to me via email. I'll do my best. I won't be able to answer as extensively as if you just let me go on and on and on and talk, but I'll do my best to at least give you some kind of response in the way of resources. So thank you all for listening. I hope this is helpful. Uh, and again, thanks for attending. I really appreciate it.
Alrighty, everybody. Thank you so much, Charlie, for doing this, and thank you everybody for staying up until now. Go ahead, buy those CEUs. You'll get instructions to access your CE certificates tomorrow by lunchtime, and in a few hours, you'll get that general certificate of attendance. Alrighty, we will see you on Thursday for our next webinar with Peter Sturmy. Otherwise, we can see you Friday for our OBM webinar with Nikki Postma. But all right, we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.